Welcome to the Craft Yarn Council's Stitch Away Stress interview series. I'm Mary Colucci, past Executive Director of the Council. Today I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Perri Klass, Professor of Journalism and Pediatrics at New York University. She also serves as National Medical Director of Reach Out and Read, a national nonprofit which promotes early childhood literacy by incorporating books into pediatric care. She's written extensively, both fiction and nonfiction, about medicine, children, literacy, and knitting, which is what we're going to talk about today. And many listeners may have enjoyed her columns in Knitters Magazine as well. Welcome, Perri.
Thank you.
Well, we're so pleased to have you here today. I consider you one of the first people to write about knitting in a national publication, the New York Times, and it was the Hers column entitled A Stitch in Time from 1992. And what I remember about that column is how you questioned why people took offense if you were knitting while listening to them lecture. Can you take us back to that time and how knitting became an important part of your life professionally as it was personally?
Yes, absolutely. I was first a medical student and then a resident in medical training, and this is back in the 1980s. And what I felt was that, especially during residency, it was totally fine to come to lectures as interns and residents, sit down and publicly fall asleep. Nobody minded that. We were interns. We'd been up all night in the intensive care unit. We were tired because we deserved to be tired. The speakers weren't offended, the faculty weren't offended. But if you were awake in the second row when you were knitting, as I frequently was, the speaker might stop and make some disparaging comment. Can you really be listening? Can you really be paying attention? And on either side of you was a person in wrinkled scrubs snoring. And it's like, well, why are you worried that I'm not paying attention? I'm wide awake and I'm knitting. And what I wrote about when I wrote that column asking the question was, is it because there's something, dare we say it, cozy, domestic? Are they thinking that this perhaps even looks feminine to have a young doctor awake and knitting a colorful scarf instead of a young doctor devastated, exhausted, and sound asleep? And of course, I was being a little sarcastic, but I did think that it was strange, that it was not rude to publicly sleep, and that it was sometimes people thought rude to be knitting. And I wanted to talk about what's always been true for me, which is that I listen much better if I'm knitting. I pay attention, my mind doesn't wander, I'm relaxed, I concentrate in a more helpful way, and that's still true for me.
Absolutely, and I hear that from so many knitters or crocheters, when they have been in work situations similar or perhaps different than yours, but the same concern by the people in charge of the meeting, looking askance at what they're doing, then they couldn't possibly do two things at once, right?
And when I was writing this in 1992 about the 1980s, there was no such thing as a cell phone. But nowadays, you could be sitting in a meeting and everyone around the table could be doing what I would technically describe as, playing with a cell phone. And most of the time, that is not, nobody stops the meeting to say, could you all please put your cell phones away and stop, texting. And so this idea that people could be, have their hands busy, be playing with that is now widely accepted, especially in business meetings. I also have to say, from the point of view of stress, that if know that I'm going to spend 2 hours in a meeting or an hour in a lecture, and I can think ahead to it as I'm going to work on my shawl, I look forward to the meeting, I look forward to the lecture. And we all know that sometimes without the knitting, you don't really look forward to the lecture.
Wow, I'm sure with your busy schedule to be able to, to do that at the same time as listening is a big accomplishment. Well, I know in 2004, you published a book of essays entitled Two Sweaters for My Father. And it was through these stories that you relayed the many benefits, both physical and psychological, of knitting. Well, share with us, what is the power of knitting?
Well, I think, it's obviously it's many things to many people. For me, it's one of the ways that I most happily engage with color and texture. I think quite literally it brings color and texture into my life. And when I think about knitting, when I imagine, shall I do this? Shall I do this? Shall I combine these yarns? Shall I make such and such an object? I am sort of fantasizing, imagining about color and texture and pattern in ways that don't otherwise come into my life. I think there's also just for me, clearly, and for many people, some kind of pleasure, stress reduction, mindfulness, meditation, which is the combination of the repetitive motions, the sort of the things that your hands know how to do so well that you don't have to tell them what to do, with the mental discipline of pattern and of keeping things right. And obviously that changes tremendously. There's like most knitters, I have sort of the mindless projects, the ones that I can do in a lecture. And I have to say that sometimes when I'm sitting in a meeting, I'm ostentatiously not looking down at my knitting. I'm showing you that I can look directly at the PowerPoint slides, and we all love PowerPoint slides in medicine. There's that kind of knitting, and then there's, all levels of complexity. And sometimes on the same project, if you're, making the back of the cardigan, there's a long patch of kind of mindless, straightforward knitting. And then when you come to the sleeves or the, decreases, it's a little more, you have to sort of do it and pay more attention. But I think that even thinking about those different levels of concentration is, an interesting way of engaging with your own mental processes and your concentration and your memory. And then, of course, there's that really exciting moment when even a somewhat complicated pattern, if you're doing it over a long piece of work, becomes memorized by your fingers. And they can perform they can perform the pattern without you having to count.
It's exciting.
Yeah, it's really fun.
Yes. I just have to share that the story about the sweater, the first sweater that you made for your dad, the single crochet. It just brought tears to my eyes, and I think any of us who've done any crocheting, we just related to that story so well.
It was the strongest, stiffest sweater anyone could ever have made.
Well, all of us were impacted by September 11th. How do you think it impacted knitters?
Well, most immediately, there was the issue that we couldn't take knitting needles on airplanes.
Yes.
And I wrote about that. And that was, of course, since flying and traveling were for many people a little scarier right then, and all the security measures were new, and for some people very anxiety provoking. I think that to be told that you couldn't be knitting on the airplane made it that much harder. But over time, we know those rules relaxed. Knitting needles are now all right. I think that, the other piece we can say about that is that when knitting is what you love, or working with your hands, it also becomes one of the ways that you connect with other people, that you feel less isolated at times, that you might otherwise feel more separated, more isolated, more alone.
Absolutely. I think we saw so many people come together, in groups, and there's this exchange when you have different people from different backgrounds, but they share that love of the craft, and it gets them talking and sharing, and it helps them deal with a lot of issues. Right. In a more recent New York Times column that you wrote called In Knitting, Lessons of Empathy, you compare the knitting world to parenting. Talk a little bit about that column.
Well, again, of course, I was being a little silly, but I write regularly about parenting in the New York Times. And when you read the comments that people make, I find them often really harsh and judgmental about parenting, about other people, specifically about, I saw a family recently and either it will be, and the child was running wild and the parents did nothing to control the child and it spoiled my dinner. Or alternatively, and the child was sort of sitting there looking so sad and the parents were busy with their cell phones. And so it will either be parents today are so terribly indulgent, or parents today are so lost in their own world and ignore it, whatever it is. And I compared it to the way that on Ravelry, on a knitting website, people tell you that your work is beautiful or they keep quiet. They, recognize that the world is full of knitters who are spending a tremendous amount of time and effort on patterns or on yarns or on projects that don't appeal to me, but I'll stay away from that. That's not my issue. I'm not put on this earth to tell people that's an ugly color. That's a, miserable pattern to choose out of all the patterns in the world. And yet somehow, with parenting, where you would think we would start from the idea that whoever those parents are, they probably love that child and they're probably doing their best. And you may be seeing the best parent on the worst day or the worst minute of somebody's day. There's not a lot of that feeling of charity and of acceptance that everybody's got a complicated story. And of course, the people who write in and comment on news stories are not necessarily a representative sample. And even among them, this is not true of everyone. But when you write about parenting, you encounter a tremendous amount of fairly harsh, you should feel guilty, you're a terrible parent, judgmentalism. So that, for example, if I say in a column, which I've often said, if I admit to not having done something perfectly myself as a parent, and, I say I'm a pediatrician, I tell everybody to, that a good way to discipline a toddler is to think about putting the child in timeout. But I have to confess that as a parent, I was never able to do that successfully. Someone will certainly write in to say, you were probably, a terrible parent. You failed to set limits. Your children are doomed and it's all your fault. And sort of think, really?
Well, speaking of children, what do you think about children learning to knit and crochet? Have you had that experience personally or teaching?
I've taught, I have taught, I'm not a good teacher of knitting. I think I'm one of those people who learned so young that I cannot really successfully break it down into the individual components. I knit, but I can't explain how I knit. I was, taught very young, and my hands learned it. It's eidetic memory, and I can't explain it well. So when my children learned to knit, I actually took advantage of people who were much better knitting teachers and could explain better. But I think it's a great thing for children to learn. I think it's a wonderful skill to have. And back in the old days, I would have said a wonderful thing for a child to have on a long car trip. But of course, now mostly children have other resources on long car trips.
Thank God.
I still knit in the car.
Right. Well, what advice would you offer to folks struggling with the everyday demands of parenting and work, and how knitting and crocheting might help?
I would say to everyone that you need to do your best with your job, you need to do your best with your family, and you also need to find some piece of the world, some things that are for you. And for me, one of those has always been knitting. Another has always been writing, which has not always been part of my job, and writing about knitting brings them together. But I think that one of the joys of knitting is that you have a project. If you have a bad week and you don't get to it, it waits for you peacefully, quietly. It doesn't, atrophy or go bad or spoil. It waits for you. And one of the things when my kids were young was that I honestly, I enjoyed knitting for them because you could finish things so quickly. And it was one of my demonstrable skills as a mother. I've written about this, was to be able to say, okay, pick the sweater you like out of this book. Oh, you want the one with the penguins? I'll make the one with the penguins. And that one of the things that, it was a way of actually doing something for my children to keep them warm, but it also brought me that pleasure and relaxation and satisfaction.
Oh, that's great. And I noticed that you are wrapped in a very pretty, colorful. Is that going to be a scarf, a shawl, or?
Oh, I think I wasn't sure until I finished it whether it was going to be long enough to be a shawl, but I think it's a shawl. And I was working on it at a meeting that I went to, and I loved being at the meeting. I loved realizing that I was going to finish the shawl at the meeting.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you again for spending some time with us this morning, and just want to mention to our listeners that we will have a link to your website so they can learn more about all of the writing that you've done. And it's been a pleasure seeing you again and catching up, and happy knitting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again.